Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Arti Holamaini. I'm Secretary General of ESOA, and we represent global and regional satellite operators, many of which are providing satellite services, communication services across Latin America. I'm delighted to welcome you to this showcase session today, where we're going to be looking at the question, is Spectrum the answer to Latin America's connectivity questions? Next slide. So, according to the latest report, which I believe was issued just last week from the Inter-American Development Bank and Microsoft, 77 million people do not have quality internet access in rural Latin America. Even in urban areas, 29% of residents have no internet access at all, and 32% of all residents in Latin America have no internet access at all. UNCTAD, the UN agency, has also made statements. They consider that 2/3 of people in Latin America have internet access, and they give the example of Nicaragua, where only 25% have access. We know that with the current situation, most governments across Latin America do have plans to expand digital infrastructure and get more people connected. But is Spectrum the answer? Well, we know that if we try to expand fiber everywhere, that is cost prohibitive. It makes no economic sense, and it's not a realistic solution. Fixed wireless access is an alternative, and it's better, but not if we try to implement it in millimeter wave, because multiple small cells are still expensive. What about C-band? There is often the suggestion that C-band is the answer to coverage. Well, you still need to extend base stations and fiber backhaul to complete the solution, even using C-band spectrum, and that is expensive as well. What about satellite? Well, with satellite technology, we know that we have pan-Latin American coverage, and today already satellite service providers are enabling up to 100 megabit per second at competitive rates for direct satellite broadband connections. Those installations can be put into place within a couple of hours, and they are low cost. To give you an example from Mexico, users pay 50 cents or less per hour to be connected. So when we talk about satellite broadband, we're actually talking about 3 different ways of bringing people online. One is community internet or community Wi-Fi, which you can see in the image on the left. With that solution, we can have connectivity within 500 meters from a point of installation, so a radius of 500 meters. We also have direct-to-consumer broadband, which means putting a dish on the premises, be it on a house, on a school, on a shop, on a library, on a government office. And here's an example from Mexico, where one of our members is connecting over 2,500 sites, and that translates into bringing 1.8 million people or more who were previously unconnected online. Next slide. The third solution, which I will come to in a minute, is satellite backhaul. But first, staying with direct satellite broadband, how does it work? It's actually very simple. Users visit a retailer, they buy a PIN code, the retailer collects the cash from them, and the user connects by entering the PIN code that he receives from the retailer, and all of a sudden he's online. It really is very simple. Next slide. I mentioned satellite backhaul, and this is a really important way of expanding mobile coverage where it is cost ineffective and too costly and too time consuming and cumbersome to reach the rural areas and roll out mobile base stations all the way. And this is a very important solution, and we know that it is in place across many parts of Latin America. Next slide. Where people are relying on satellite for their broadband connectivity, we know it works. And there's a lot of doubts often expressed that satellite doesn't work for streaming, it only works for voice. And I wanted to share with you an extract of a study from Sandvine. They issued their Global Internet Phenomena report back in May, and they looked at each of the different technologies. And when they look at satellite, they saw that across the Americas, the most important applications that were being used were YouTube, WhatsApp, and Netflix. So that should really dispel any myths around satellite is slow, it doesn't work, it's only good for certain applications. It is as good as any other broadband platform where it is being used. Next slide. I wanted to share a couple of examples from Latin America. The first is a satellite backhaul solution, and it's in rural Peru. So across Peru, one of our members is connecting 154 rural communities to the internet, and that is satellite backhaul. We know that connecting rural communities is expensive and risky for mobile operators, but the model with which this solution is implemented allows those operators to pay only for the traffic that their end users are consuming, and they don't have to bear the risk associated with building out the network all the way to the rural communities. Next slide. I wanted to close with a couple of direct satellite broadband examples and give you a testimony from a teacher in La Higuera in Chile, where this teacher is based 500 kilometers north of Santiago. He shows with this quote how the internet has transformed his life. And he says that antenna is my entertainment to find information and communicate with others. There's no distance, there's no remote places anymore. The lack of cables is not an impediment to being connected. And that's thanks to satellite. And the last image here is actually a satellite installer who's carrying a satellite dish on his back and riding on horseback to a rural community. So we have these connectivity solutions implemented across Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Jamaica, Guatemala, and Peru. But coming back to the question, and I'm going to hand over to Richard now, is how does Spectrum help? Is Spectrum the answer? For me, if Spectrum was the answer, then why are we seeing so many different solutions which are not mobile, which are actually other technologies, be it satellite, be it WISPs, being implemented everywhere? Richard, let me hand over to you. And before I do that, let me remind the participants to please post their questions and their comments in the chat. Thanks a lot. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Artie. So we're going to have a look at the question of, is Spectrum the answer? If I could have the slides, please. So the question is Spectrum the answer? If I could have the next slide, please. And I think we need to focus that question just a little bit more. Is Spectrum the answer to what? And I know Artie said to connectivity issues, but I think there's multiple things we need to think about. Is Spectrum the answer to ubiquitous coverage? Does it mean that we can cover everywhere? Does it bridge the digital divide? Is Spectrum the answer to superfast broadband? All of these things I think we need to consider when we try and figure out where Spectrum fits within the question. If I could have the next slide, please. When we are considering rolling out a telecommunications network of any kind, whether it's a fixed network or a wireless network, there are three things which have to be balanced. And those things are coverage, capacity, and cost. And you can't change one of those without it affecting the others. So now we're going to consider, if we bring Spectrum into that mix, how does it affect the balance between coverage, cost, and capacity? Can we increase coverage? Does it reduce cost? Do we get more capacity? And I think by answering those questions, we can get somewhere towards thinking about whether Spectrum is in fact the answer to some of these connectivity issues that Artie's already raised. Next slide, please. So let's start with the coverage question. Is Spectrum the answer to increasing coverage? Well, there are different spectrum bands, and those which have the lowest frequency, the sub 1 gigahertz bands, provide very good coverage. From a single cell site, you might achieve 10, 15 kilometers in a rural area. If you go higher in frequency towards C-band and greater, then that coverage starts to reduce. And so, yes, low frequencies do provide better coverage than high frequencies. However, there's still an issue here to do with cost, because we can't just give people Spectrum in those lower bands and expect that to solve the coverage problem, because it's not going to solve anything unless they build out the infrastructure to use that Spectrum. And of course, we're back to that question of cost again. If we are going to build new infrastructure, that means that we need additional cost. It's going to cost us more money. Now, sorry if we could just go back to that slide for a second. Thank you. If we have more spectrum in an existing band, so a band that the operators already have access to, that doesn't necessarily improve coverage. Just because there's infrastructure in place that's using that spectrum, if we give more spectrum in the same band, a band that's already in use and already has infrastructure, that doesn't really impact coverage at all, because we still need to introduce more infrastructure and we still need more cost. So does spectrum help with coverage? Low frequencies might, but there's still a very large cost associated with using it. Next slide, please. So what about the question of capacity? If you have more spectrum, do you gain more capacity? Well, the answer to that is probably yes, you do. The more spectrum you have, the more capacity you're able to carry. But it requires you to actually use the spectrum that you have. And there's two parts to using it. There is having received it, having won it at an auction, having been assigned spectrum and actually putting that into use. But there's a stage before that that in fact we need to address as well, which is the fact that many countries haven't yet assigned all of the spectrum that's available. So the chart on the right there shows for a number of countries in the region how much spectrum has been assigned to mobile operators. And the blue bars show the situation as it was in 2014. The red bars show the situation as it is in 2020. If there's a country with only a red bar, that doesn't mean there was no spectrum in 2014. It just means I have no data for it. So you can see towards the right-hand side there, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia have increased the amount of spectrum that the mobile operators have access to. But let me explain the rest of this chart. The yellow line is the amount of spectrum that is harmonized across all the available mobile bands. So if you were to take the AWS band, the 1900 megahertz band, 850, 2600, add all those bands together, you find there's about 1100 megahertz of spectrum which could be assigned to mobile operators in harmonized bands with off-the-shelf equipment. The orange bar just above that shows the amount that the ITU has identified for mobile services. And you might wonder why that's bigger than the amount that's harmonized. Because actually the amount harmonized in some cases has to be then broken down into bands, and there's little gaps between them. So different countries in the region have access to different amounts of spectrum. And the orange bar represents that, which has or was in fact identified prior to the last WRC. And I want to talk about the new WRC in a second. The red bar is the forecast that was made prior to WRC 15 by the ITU for how much spectrum would be needed to meet the capacity requirements. Now look at this. We've got anything up to 2000 megahertz of spectrum required, or at least forecast to be required, in order to meet these current capacity requirements. And I would say the average amount of spectrum that's been assigned to operators is something in the region of 500 megahertz. So we are a little bit short on how much spectrum we have assigned relative to that that's needed. Now, at the last WRC, several tens of gigahertz of new millimeter wave spectrum were found for the mobile operators for 5G. If we were to add that into this chart, the bars at the bottom would disappear. It's something in the region of, if you imagine this on a normal laptop screen, if that's what you're seeing it on, if you imagine that your screen was now about 2 meters high, then the new amount of spectrum is somewhere at the top of that 2 meter screen. It's a lot. And I suspect if we come back to this before the next WRC, we'll find that the level that's harmonized and the amount that's available will be so high that the amount that's assigned will disappear. Now, back to this question of balance. New spectrum gives more capacity. It does, there's no question, but you have to build the infrastructure out, and therefore there is additional cost involved. So does it solve capacity problems? It can, but it involves more cost. I'm just going to say that again because the bell just rang. It's a fire alarm test. So does new spectrum give more capacity? Yes, it can, but we have to build out new infrastructure, and that involves more cost. Next slide, please. So back to this question, is spectrum the answer? Well, let's start at the beginning. Yes, of course it is, because without spectrum, then there is no kind of wireless broadband solution of any kind, whether that's terrestrial or satellite, fixed wireless, backhaul. So yes, of course, we need spectrum for that. Does it solve the coverage and capacity problems? Well, without additional spectrum, with additional spectrum, comes with that additional cost because you have to build out more infrastructure. So does spectrum on its own solve coverage and capacity? Not really. Does spectrum, if we give operators spectrum in new bands, they still have to build out infrastructure, and that requires additional cost. What about capacity? Well, yes, more spectrum does improve capacity, but it also it increases the cost. So spectrum is part of the answer. It's not the complete answer. And there's one last thing to bear in mind before I hand this back to Artie, which is that I've really talked a lot about spectrum for mobile operators. And I think that's where we see with 4G and 5G, we expect that to be where connectivity comes from. And I think Artie's already shown very clearly that that's not necessarily the case. Spectrum is something that's needed for all wireless technology solutions. And if we're going to provide those Wi-Fi hotspots in Mexico, or provide a job for the cowboy carrying the dish on his back to rural, and it was Peru, was it? Then we have to make sure that all of the wireless technology solutions have access to spectrum so that they can provide the coverage and the capacity that I think we all believe is necessary. Thank you very much, and I'll return to Artie.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for that excellent presentation. I hope the viewers found that interesting. And as I said, I would invite everybody to please post their questions in the chat. We're now going to get an interactive discussion going, and I'm calling upon my colleague Haz Moakit from Intelsat to kindly moderate that with Richard. Thank you for participating.
Sorry, Haz. I think you're on mute there.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. That's much better. Now you can hear me. So thank you, Richard. I really appreciate your presentation and Artie's presentation. Certainly a wealth of information, very insightful. So what struck me is this issue of connectivity in South America. So in Latin America, what do you think the coverage? Is it a coverage gap that we have over there in terms of not being able to be connected, or is it a usage gap?
Well, does one not lead to the other? Has I mean, if you don't have coverage, you can't use the connection, right? So you need a connection first before you start thinking about the usage. I mean, I suppose if the question is, is the problem one of connectivity, is the problem one of coverage, or is the problem one of speeds and so on? There's been a couple of interesting polls when we've done this conference in other regions where we've asked the question, as a result of COVID, what is it that is most important when it comes to connectivity? Is it coverage? Is it capacity? Is it reliability? Or is it something else? And typically, coverage and reliability have come out as being more important than speed. So going back to your question, I think if we're looking at the difference between usability and speed versus actually having a connection, I think the connection is the bit that people really want to try and get hold of.
Great. So, in fact, it's kind of an interesting point. I was reading the GSMA report, the Mobile Economy Report for Latin America of 2019. And in there, they say that while 94% of the population in Latin America is covered by some sort of mobile internet network, only 48% of those are actually subscribers. So there is coverage in certain areas. The service is there, but it's what the report claims is that the only 48% of the people are actually subscribers. So perhaps this is really more of an affordability issue in parts of in South America. I mean, is it, in other words, to your point, what you brought up, if we introduce more spectrum, which is going to require more infrastructure to be deployed, that means that the costs are going to go up and the prices are going to go up, and that may exacerbate the affordability issue. So, what are your views on that? I mean,
I mean, affordability is obviously very, very critical. And I'm surprised it's as low as, I think you said, give or take 50% of those who have a service available actually connect to it. And I think we have to bear in mind that connectivity of that kind, mobile wireless connectivity, if we're talking about that available to a typical mobile handset, then the affordability comes down to the price of those handsets. So if we're talking in rural poor areas where people don't have lots of money to spend on a smartphone or a feature phone, it may well be they're still connected, but they're just happy with voice and text messages because for their day-to-day usage, that suits them. And I think that goes exactly back to what I was just saying, which is that, we always look at this as a problem of speed. And actually, if you give people a connection, there's a lot they can do with it, even if it's not so fast. So, I mean, back to you, as you've read the report, but I guess what they're talking about is people taking up broadband subscriptions. And another question associated with that, I suppose, is if you do have a smartphone and you're in an area that does have 4G or 3G connectivity, but there's also Wi-Fi available, do you bother with the broadband connection, or do you just use the Wi-Fi and be happy with that?
Indeed. With respect to Artie's presentation, I'm not sure if you would be able to speak to it a little bit, but it's about the role of satellites in really bridging the gap in South America, in countries in areas that don't have satellite and that don't have internet access or mobile access, and where satellites serve. Do you have any views on that in terms of how much that helps for connectivity?
Well, it has to help enormously. I mean, the question of how you get connectivity to rural areas, you have to bear in mind that if you want to set up a cell tower in somewhere to provide coverage from a mobile network, it's not just building the tower, and you've also got to supply power, which can be quite significant for a cell tower. And you've got to provide the backhaul, and there's the problem, right? If you're in a remote location, how do you get that cell site connected back to the central network? Can you put up a string of microwave connections? Do you try and lay fiber? How do you do that? And so satellite in itself plays a role there, because many, I think, remote base stations in some of these areas do rely on satellite. But obviously, to build a base station, you don't just need the satellite connection. You need a compound. You need to lay some concrete. You need to build a tower. You need to ship in expensive equipment. Whereas I think one of the solutions that Artie was showing, which I think was Mexico, was a satellite dish connected to a Wi-Fi hotspot, and that's it. So there's no need for a tower, and affordability becomes much easier, right? Because we're now just putting in some relatively basic equipment that we saw being carried by on the back of a horse, and the power requirements are much less as well. So that is far more affordable. a solution like that, and satellite obviously can provide that. It can't be done any other way. There is no simple way to make that kind of rural connectivity unless you want to roll out fiber or put strings of microwave links in across hilltops, which are expensive, difficult to maintain, and so on.
Yeah, true. I mean, and to that point, if affordability is an issue and cost and making the business case close for the MNOs, introducing higher frequency bands that will require much more intense investment in the infrastructure. I mean, if you talk about C-band, for example, the densification that's required can be anywhere up to 10 times of the current network. So when you factor that in, that means that the deployment is going to have to be very limited, or it's going to be very costly. So simply introducing additional spectrum in this respect is not going to really solve the problem. That means that the MNOs now have a much tougher business case to close because they have to build more. Or the flip side of it is that they end up only serving the lucrative areas of their coverage, not the broader population, which ends up exacerbating the gap between those who have very good, excellent connections and those who don't. To again, another point with respect to spectrum, again from the GSMA report, at this point, 4G still has a long way to go in South America because less than 50% of the connections right now I keep referring to South America or Latin America, but less than 50% of the connections are actually 4G. So we are still nowhere near the tipping point where 4G has been used up, and there's time to go to 5G. In fact, they anticipate that the 5G connections by 2025 will only amount to about 5 or 6% of all connections. So clearly, when you put these pieces together, you recognize that perhaps adding more spectrum is not necessarily the solution, to the problem that we have right now.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, you remember that chart that I showed of how much spectrum has actually been assigned to mobile operators across Latin America, and it's not very much in many countries. And that itself will restrict the ability of operators to provide a cost-effective service. There can be too little spectrum as well as too much. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to make sure that, we're talking about here trying to provide that first layer of coverage, which requires the lower frequency bands. Many of those lower frequency bands still haven't been cleared of television broadcasting and other things and aren't available. And you're right, Haz, we don't want to be moving up in frequency to C-band and beyond, where there's such a need for densification of networks, because that's never going to be cost effective. Certainly not for the disconnected in the rural areas. Going the other way is good, but most of that spectrum is currently used for television broadcasting. And again, to clear that service across the region is difficult. So, yeah, I'm not sure spectrum is the answer, but not enough. People say, don't they, that money doesn't make you happy, but not enough money makes you unhappy. And I think you could apply the same to spectrum. If you've got too much spectrum, it doesn't make your network any better. But if you haven't got enough, you could desperately use some more.
Agreed. I mean, I was listening to some of the earlier presentations today, and obviously the direction of the mobile industry is that more is better. Of course, if you have 200 megahertz instead of 100 megahertz, of course, that makes your life simpler. But there's when regulators look at it, they need to look at it from a different perspective in order to eliminate waste or inefficient use of spectrum. So when you look at situations like Mexico, for example, where MNOs are actually returning spectrum to the regulator because they're not using it, it certainly raises a question about about how much spectrum is there and is there enough. The other point is that I think the MNOs are going through, perhaps some of them are going through a paradigm shift in how they deploy their networks. When you consider the densification that is required and the amount of capital costs that are required, a lot of them are shifting, or some of them, I should say, are shifting towards shared spectrum. You can virtualize the network in shared spectrum and achieve much higher efficient use of the spectrum as opposed to the traditional model where everybody had to have his or her piece of spectrum exclusively, which certainly made sense in the lower frequencies because the amount of spectrum that was made available was, in the single digits, 10, 15, 20 megahertz. But now that we're talking about deploying a network that relies on a 60 megahertz or 100 megahertz carrier, and if everybody's going to duplicate that, there's an enormous amount of waste that's going to be made in these networks in terms of the usage, in terms of the density of usage of these networks. So in fact, some MNOs are shifting slowly toward a virtualized network as opposed to an exclusive auction spectrum network.
Well, of course, there's a logical conclusion to that, which is that you have a single network and everybody takes service from that, which of course is exactly what's happened in Mexico in the 700 megahertz band, where the whole band was awarded to a wholesale operator to roll out the network, and that's then available. Capacity can be purchased by any of the other operators. So that clearly makes sense, especially if you're going to do something in a band that doesn't have much spectrum available. It does have consequences, and one of those consequences is competition, because operators like to differentiate themselves on speed, on coverage, on issues such as that. And of course, if you just have that single network providing all of the services, then you don't get that competitive edge. Everybody's service is the same. So you do lose a little bit, but at the same time, the economic gains are significant. And it's not just in Latin America. I mean, I think Rwanda has done something very similar and very successfully, actually, awarding a whole band to a wholesale operator who was able to roll out the network at a third the cost. If you've got 1/3 of the network infrastructure because you've got one operator instead of three, roughly speaking, you've got a third of the cost. So it makes a great deal of sense. And I should just pick up, you talked a little bit about access to spectrum. At the moment, we have this model where it's individual, it's exclusive, and everybody has their own piece of spectrum. But there is also a model that says, well, certainly for the higher frequency bands, shouldn't we all be sharing? The not just having a wholesale network, but sharing networks between users, because when we get to C-band and millimeter wave, the coverage is so small that although, like you say, you might cherry pick the commercial areas, there might be people in other areas who wish to provide a service, whether it's for themselves or for a community, who could use that same spectrum. But if it's been exclusively given to somebody, then they can't do that. So I think we have to also look at the licensing model as to how we hand out spectrum in those higher frequency bands to make sure that it's providing the best benefit to everybody that could use it.
Indeed, it's time to rethink the entire model, because the way it was done before was perhaps not suitable to how things should be with these higher frequencies, be it mid-band or millimeter wave, because the exclusive licensing model may be inefficient in this instance.
Agreed. Yeah, the exclusive licensing model is not a great model for bands where your cell site's going to cover 400-500 meters, unless it's on top of a very tall building. It just doesn't make any sense to have exclusive licenses in those kind of bands.
It also raises a question about coverage obligations. In the lower frequencies, regulators require a certain coverage obligation within the license. But I can imagine that imposing such obligations on somebody who just won a mid-band spectrum or millimeter wave spectrum to say that you're supposed to cover 90% of the population within 3 years, that must be an enormous undertaking.
Oh, it's very, very significant. In fact, there was some work that I was involved in which looked at the speed of rollout, the quality of connections and the coverage, and compared that with the obligations which have been put on operators when they took on the spectrum. So you obviously have operators who've taken on spectrum that had a coverage obligation associated with it, and there is a very large cost associated with that. And in other countries, you've got the same kind of situation, the same frequency band, but no coverage obligations. And what you found was actually that the ones where they had no coverage obligations, the networks tended to grow more quickly. So imposing these kind of obligations isn't necessarily a particularly good thing to do, because I think it kind of, in a way, it reduces the incentive to invest. I mean, Germany had a very odd situation where they actually, the coverage obligation worked in reverse. So you had to cover the uncovered rural areas before you were allowed to use that spectrum in cities. And I know there are cell sites which have been built in some of the rural parts of Germany that have no traffic on them because there's just no population or insignificant population. So getting these things right is very difficult, and certainly just imposing things, I think, is not necessarily a positive way forward.
Agreed. Well, do we have any questions? I don't see any questions from the audience, so I guess we can. Let's see. Not sure how much time we have left, or should we carry it forward?
We've got about 5 minutes, I think, Has. I mean, maybe I could pose a question to you. I know that this is not the done thing, but we're talking here about spectrum, and obviously, as a satellite operator, your interest is in the bands that you use at the moment. C-band is obviously under pressure from 5G, but now there's moves into some of the higher frequency bands as well. So where do you see this going? I mean, is this spectrum going to be used for mobile? Is it being, in your experience, is it going to be used, or is this just a case of, please, sir, we need some more, and we'll just use whatever we can find, however complicated it is?
I think there is a lot of exuberance right now in terms of what they envisage that they can have on the spectrum. I put the analogy of a shark. They bite first, and then they decide later whether they want to keep it or not. So, because in the case of the U.S., when it came to C-band, I think there was a genuinely different situation, and this is a point actually that's important to highlight, is that in my opinion, there's an extent to which harmonization or copying what others have done works, because every region you harmonize to the extent that you can, but then you need to look at your own situation, your usage profile, and then you sort of make your own decisions. In the U.S., the C-band spectrum first was primarily used as a B2B spectrum, so it was primarily used by businesses, and although there was a large number of earth stations, but nonetheless it was a contained number of earth stations. So we knew that there was south of 20,000 or so antennas that were being used in the U.S. So there was a limited universe. And then the other component in the U.S. is that why couldn't they look at the extended C-band? The extended C-band, the 3.4 to 3.7, was already consumed by the federal users, by federal users, government. So it was impossible to eject them out of that spectrum. So, and at the same time, there was a genuine spectrum crunch for the major MNOs, and mid-band spectrum was needed. So there was only one way for them to look at, which is at C-band, at the 3.7 to 4.2. And that's when the satellite industry sort of realized the situation, and then they said, rather than extract the spectrum away from us by force, let's work a solution where we can ensure the continuity of the business. So this is the situation in the U.S. here. You cannot simply copy it and say, well, if the U.S. cleared up to 4 gigahertz, then why didn't you clear the same in South America? I'll say, stop 1 minute here, because look at the amount of spectrum that was cleared and compare it to other regions. don't bother with the range exactly, the fact that 3.7 to 4 gigahertz, but look at the fact that only 280 megahertz were made available. You could do the same, or you can release the same amount of spectrum in your country using the 3.3 to 3.6. So it does not have to be in the same frequency range as the US. And the ranges right now have the flexibility to cover the entire band. So the FCC has released 280 megahertz in spectrum, mid-band spectrum terminals, which will be auctioned later this year in December. So the same can be said about using or releasing the same amount of spectrum in the 3.3 to 3.6 or 3.3 to 3.7. So that puts you on par on the amount of spectrum that is being released. So I think people don't need to focus too much on the exact ranges that they released this part of the spectrum. So therefore, we should release the same. They should look at the overall outcome in terms of the amount of spectrum, not necessarily the spectrum range itself.
That's an interesting point. I just want to pick up on one thing on that, Haz, and I know we're running out of time. So, but the 3G band N79, which is 4.4 to 5 gigahertz, also overlaps with some C-band satellite spectrum. Is that a concern as well? Is that heavily used?
That is a part of the planned band. It overlaps with the planned band, which is called the Appendix 30B band. That is not very heavily used actually by satellite operators. This is because this allocation is shared with fixed service. There's a lot of fixed service used in the band, and there's often government use in this band. So it is not really a band that's heavily used by satellite operators. But I think you're going to see a lot of resistance even using it terrestrially because of the incumbents in the band.
I just wondered. Thank you for that. I think we're just about out of time, actually.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. And
pleasure.
It was an interesting conversation. And we'll move on to the next session. Thank you.